Imagine the Khalifa al-Ma'mun standing at the entrance of a grand stone building in the 9th century Baghdad. Listen to the sound that fills this space. The rustling of parchment, the murmur of scholars debating in half a dozen languages. The Greco-Roman translation movement was unlike anything seen before. The government sponsored scholars to study the works of ancient civilizations, the famous Greeks, saving the texts of the likes of Plato, Aristotle, Ptolemy from being completely forgotten. But this was not mere preservation. Greek philosophy met and intertwined with Islamic thought. Ancient medicine was tested against new observations. Mathematical concepts were refined and expanded. This is the story of how one civilization saved the knowledge of another, and in doing so, transformed itself and the intellectual trajectory of the entire world forever. In order to understand this translation movement, we need to set up the scene and the context. With little science, philosophy, or literature of their own, the early Muslims embraced learning about the intellectual cultures of the people they conquered with a gusto and enthusiasm rarely seen before. Al-Mansur himself had requested and received a number of books from the Byzantine emperor, including books of the great mathematician Euclid. Then, Abbasid military campaigns in Byzantine lands led to the acquisition of many more Greek manuscripts during the times of Harun al-Rashid, and also Al-Ma'mun sent further requests to the Emperor Leo for sending over more Greek works. Now the Arabs didn't know Greek, so they first employed translators from their non-Muslim subjects, such as some of the Jewish and also Nestorian Christians. These early Syrian Nestorians first translated the Greek works into Aramaic or maybe even Syriac, and then another group of translators translated them into Arabic. The first translations included Greek medicine as represented by Galen and Paul, Greek mathematics and allied sciences through Euclid and Ptolemy, and then later the philosophy and metaphysics of Plato and Aristotle, and then also the explanations by later Neoplatonic philosophers. The metaphysics were a revised version of their ancient Greek mythology, but this worldview did not deeply penetrate into the theology of the Muslim world. In fact, during this formative period, the main concern of philosophers in the Islamic world was the translation and interpretation of Greek philosophical texts, especially those of Aristotle. Figures like Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi championed these texts and insisted that they contained truths of paramount importance for any reader, regardless of whether they were pagan or Christian or Muslim. Yet, these same thinkers pondered the question of how the Hellenic philosophical heritage could be reconciled with the teachings of Islam, and whether it might offer answers to questions being posed by contemporary Muslim theologians. The great city of Baghdad was finished in the year 765 CE by the Khalifa al-Mansur, and within 75 years it possessed the chief philosophical works of Aristotle, the leading Neoplatonic commentators, and most importantly, the medical works of Galen. Along with this, many important Persian and Indian scientific works also existed, and the Muslim scholars absorbed all of these works within a few decades and then gave these works an original character. In the year 830 CE, the Khalifa al-Ma'mun officially established the Bayt Al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, to further his cause of bringing forth Greek and other works into Arabic. Contemporary scholars describe this as, and I quote, a combination library, academy, and translation bureau, which in many respects proved the most important educational institute since the foundation of the Alexandrian Museum in the first half of the 3rd century BC. Up until then, the translations from Greek were being produced sporadically and independently by Christians, Jews, and recent converts to Islam. But from the Khalifa al-Ma'mun through to his immediate successors, the work was concentrated mainly through the Bayt Al-Hikmah, the academy. The academy was also responsible for revising and improving earlier translation. The academy also had access to copyists and bookbinders, along with the top-notch scholars, and those scholars were paid very well. Of them, Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, a mathematician and astronomer, frequently credited as the founder of algebra, and he was perhaps the best known figure affiliated officially with the Bayt Al-Hikmah. One of the authors writing about this period states, and I quote, "Over the course of 150 years, the Arabs translated all available Greek books of science and philosophy. Arabic replaced Greek as the universal language of scientific inquiry. Higher education became increasingly organized in the early 9th century, and most major Muslim cities featured some type of university. With the full force and the power of the Khalifa behind it, knowledge became a part and parcel of the fabric of Baghdad, and through Baghdad, of the entire Muslim world. The Khalifa and their official scholars were not the only ones behind this campaign. The effort became an integral part of the entire Abbasid society itself, and it was supported enthusiastically by the social and political elite, from princes to merchants to thinkers to bankers and even military officers. Unfortunately, there is little mention of Bayt Al-Hikmah after Al-Ma'mun's life, but anything that remained would have inevitably been destroyed by the infamous invasion of the Mongols in 1258, when the Mongol army ransacked Baghdad. And of course, that is the topic of another lecture. The fact of the matter is, were it not for the Muslims, we would have lost many of the classical works of the Greek philosophers. The Muslims didn't just translate works, they took them and they built on them. And because of this, Arabic became a lingua franca. It became a vehicle of advanced scientific inquiry, such as Al-Khwarizmi in astronomy and navigation, who produced the two most famous star tables known as Zij as-Sind al-Hind, which were used to navigate for centuries across the Muslim world and later in Christian Europe. Another notable figure from this time frame is, of course, the famous Ibn Sina, Avicenna, who was so influential on philosophy in that part of the world that, according to one of the greatest modern authors of philosophy, Peter Adamson, the subject is simply divided between before Avicenna and after Avicenna. Avicenna also made great advancements in medicine, and he is commonly known as the father of early modern medicine. And his medical canon, Al-Qanun fi Tib, formed the basis of medical instruction in European universities up until the 17th century. And even after the significant effort of translation movement stopped, its impact continued. And much of the modern world that we see around us is in fact a product of those very efforts. There are so many lessons to learn in all of this. Of them is the famous saying, some say it's a hadith, Al-Hikmatu dallatul mu'min. Wisdom is the lost property of the believer. Of them as well, we see the Muslim civilization's thirst for knowledge and the importance of true religion as a means of sifting the good and the bad of any intellectual tradition. We also see the importance of being assured that Muslims who make such an engagement with non-Muslim cultures need to do so without a sense of inferiority or slavishness. In other words, Muslim scholars must not and cannot embrace a mental and intellectual slavery. A number of authors have pointed out that when you see this translation movement, you find some groups of those authors who translated actually absorbed those works hook, line, and sinker without understanding we have our own contributions to make. Yet others felt that there was no benefit and they acted like a type of barrier. But the best groups were those who took the best and also understood we have a mechanism, we have the Quran, and we have our tradition to sift through the good from the bad. And this also shows us that in every generation and in every time frame, the true intellectual Muslims should do the same. They should be at the forefront, like our great scholars were of the past, to take the good from other civilizations and to weigh it with what our own tradition comes with, so that we can sift through that which is beneficial from that which might particularly be harmful to the Muslim identity. And of course, this narrative has many more parallels throughout all of Islamic history. And this is the most iconic moment, but it is definitely not the only moment where civilizations met and they gave back and forth and they produced yet bigger and better civilizations. We must also be careful of how certain modern Orientalists understood this time frame as simply one in which Muslims borrowed from the earlier civilizations and then passed it on to later ones without doing anything original themselves. This narrative is a narrative that was skewed and brought forth by especially 19th century Orientalists, but it has no basis in reality. The Muslims never just took blindly, rather they absorbed, they critiqued, and they contributed. And this is something that is demonstrably proven in the fact that Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi and Kindi and others of that time frame, they didn't just take hook, line, and sinker. Rather, they commented on and they changed and they added and they sifted through. And that was the thought that was then passed on to Latin Europe. To conclude, the translation movement was a pivotal moment, not just in the history of Islam, but in the history of the global civilization. It represented a time frame in which Muslims, guided by their faith, curious because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told them to learn, opened up their hearts and their minds, and they absorbed the best of so many other cultures, and they synthesized a new culture, a culture that led the world for 1,000 years. And we as Muslims of our time frames need to look back to that spirit, look back to that inquiry, look back to that curiosity, and understand this is what Islam teaches us. And we should do the same for our times and places, guided by the Quran, having the filters that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to have, and then benefiting others and also benefiting from what they have to offer us. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself wants us to do, and this is what our pious predecessors of the past did. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.